In just 7 days, America witnessed a spectacle so riveting, so electrifying, it seemed ripped from the pages of political mythology. A single congresswoman, underestimated by the establishment, stood at the crossroads of arrogance and truth. Her name was Jasmine Crockett, and in one breathtaking week, she dismantled three titans who once seemed untouchable. The first image seared itself into the nation's memory. Donald Trump, crimson-faced, veins straining as he hurled insults meant to intimidate. His voice cracked, his gestures wild, as if the force of his own bluster could drown out the calm clarity coming from the other side of the stage. But the more he roared, the smaller he appeared, his empire of fear shrinking before a single voice that refused to shake. Then came Speaker Mike Johnson, the polished heir to a fractured Congress. He began that week with a rehearsed confidence, scripture in his pocket and smug certainty on his lips. Yet under Crockett's unflinching gaze, the smooth veneer fractured. His answers stumbled, his faith-laced slogans wilted in the heat of contradiction. The room could feel it. The man who claimed divine right to power was no match for simple, unadorned truth. And finally, the most unexpected confrontation of all. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, cloaked in black robes, perched in the safety of the nation's highest court. She spoke with judicial calm, her words wrapped in the authority of precedent. Yet Crockett's voice sliced through that solemn chamber, peeling away the illusion of impartiality. For the first time, Barrett's silence spoke louder than her words. It was the silence of someone exposed, stripped of the shield of inevitability. 3 moments, 3 collisions, each one leaving an audience stunned, divided, and breathless. Clips ricocheted across social media, hashtags blazed into existence, and living rooms buzzed with the same incredulous question. How? How did one congresswoman manage to do in a single week what opponents had failed to achieve in years? This was not politics as usual. It was something sharper, something cinematic, a week-long unraveling of arrogance by the steady hand of dignity. The villains of the story did not fall in one blow, they cracked piece by piece, under the relentless weight of one woman's composure. But how did Crockett topple 3 giants in just 1 week? The story begins with, America stood at a precipice. The air in Washington was heavy, weighted by years of division, scandal, and the gnawing sense that the very idea of democracy was slipping from the people's grasp. The courts had been stacked with loyalists in robes, men and women who promised impartiality, but delivered allegiance. Congress was paralyzed, a theater of shouting matches and hollow speeches where the common good was too often sacrificed for partisan spectacle. And above it all, the specter of Trumpism loomed a shadow that refused to fade, a movement fueled by rage, arrogance, and the unshakable belief that power belonged to the few, not the many. In this world of corruption dressed as authority, the villains strutted as though untouchable. Donald Trump, even in disgrace, carried himself like a monarch in exile, convinced his return was inevitable. He barked into cameras with the conviction of a man who believed rules were written only for others. His smirk, his swagger, his certainty that he alone could command the headlines, it all fed the myth of invulnerability. Beside him, Speaker Mike Johnson emerged as the pious shield-bearer of that same arrogance. With scripture on his tongue and calculation in his eyes, he styled himself as the moral compass of Congress. Yet behind that polished image lay a man who wielded faith like a weapon, dressing corruption in robes of righteousness. In the fractured halls of power, Johnson seemed unshakable, a man bolstered by allies, protected by titles, and untouchable to critics. And then there was Justice Amy Coney Barrett, robed in the majesty of the Supreme Court. To many, she was the symbol of permanence, a reminder that Trump's legacy had seeped into the very foundation of the Republic. Her words carried the weight of law, her silence the intimidation of inevitability. To question her was to question the sanctity of the court itself. She appeared as untouchable as marble, cold and unyielding. It was in this landscape that Jasmine Crockett entered the frame. A freshman congresswoman with no dynasty, no billionaire backing, no illusion of invulnerability. To the establishment, she was just another voice, one of hundreds, a name barely known outside of Texas, dismissed as fiery, but forgettable. They saw her as background noise, an underdog who might land a punch in committee hearings, but would fade back into obscurity once the cameras turned away. But what they did not see was the steel beneath her words. Crockett carried the weight of lived struggle, the immigrant stories, the working-class battles, the fight for dignity that echoed through every syllable. She was not playing for status or legacy. She was speaking for survival, for justice, for the millions who felt erased by the smugness of the powerful. That authenticity was her weapon, one the establishment never recognized until it was too late. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, the arrogance of entrenched power, men and women so sure of their dominance they barely noticed the people they dismissed. On the other, a lone congresswoman, underestimated, unheralded, yet carrying the fire of a movement too vast to ignore. The stage was set. The villains believed they were unbreakable, protected by robes, titles, and bluster. They saw Crockett as no threat at all, a minor voice in a deafening chamber. They thought she'd fold under pressure, but then came the first strike. Donald Trump had built his career on bluster, on the sheer volume of his voice and the spectacle of his presence. He was the ringmaster of chaos, a man who believed that insults could substitute for arguments, that intimidation was the same as truth. Whenever he entered a room, the air changed not because of wisdom or integrity, but because his bombast demanded attention. And for years it had worked. Opponents froze in his shadow, swallowed by the fear of being ridiculed, diminished, or devoured by his relentless attacks. But this time was different. The cameras were rolling, the crowd buzzing, the room charged with the kind of tension that precedes history. Trump leaned forward, jaw tight, voice rising in that familiar crescendo of grievance. He attacked her background, mocked her district, and sneered with the arrogance of a man who thought the script would play out as it always had. He would dominate. She would falter. He punctuated every sentence with dismissive gestures, his hands slicing the air like a conductor of resentment. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice didn't rise to meet his. She didn't try to outshout the former president or match the tempo of his rage. Instead, she paused. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the audience to feel the imbalance between his frenzy and her calm. And then, with surgical precision, she began to dismantle him. She started with irony, gently pointing out that the man who branded himself a champion of law and order was facing more indictments than the average criminal defendant. She turned his favorite talking points inside out, showing the contradictions between his rhetoric and his record. He claimed to defend working Americans, yet his policies had gutted protections for workers. He claimed to be a man of faith, yet his public life was a parade of arrogance and cruelty. Each line landed with the quiet force of undeniable truth. Trump tried to interrupt, but every attempt made him look smaller, more desperate. His insults, once sharp, now rang hollow against the composure of a woman who refused to be shaken. Where he raged, she smiled. Where he sneered, she exposed. It was not a shouting match, it was a revelation. And the audience felt it. Gasps rippled through the room when she referenced his broken promises. A murmur rose when she highlighted the irony of a billionaire crying victimhood while ordinary Americans suffered. And when she ended one rebuttal with a phrase that cut through his facade, "Your legacy isn't strength, it's fear." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Beyond the walls of that confrontation, the reaction was instantaneous. Clips of the exchange exploded across social media within hours. Hashtags trended. Yes, Crockett crushes Trump. Truth vs. bluster. Dignity over hate. Millions watched as the once dominant showman looked rattled, his empire of intimidation punctured by a calm voice that refused to bow. Memes spread of Trump's reddened face alongside Crockett's unflinching expression. Commentators on cable news called it a seismic moment. Late-night hosts replayed the footage with awe, and voters who had never heard her name suddenly couldn't stop saying it. For Trump, the confrontation was supposed to be routine, another stage where he could overwhelm, another opponent to belittle into silence. Instead, it became a portrait of weakness, his greatest weapon, the force of his personality, had been neutralized not by louder noise but by the power of composure. Crockett didn't just win an argument. She stripped him of the aura that made him untouchable. And as the week pressed forward, that aura continued to crumble. For Crockett, the victory was not the applause or the viral clips. It was the proof that truth, delivered without fear, could pierce even the thickest armor of arrogance. She had faced the villain who defined a political era and left him rattled, diminished, and exposed. If that wasn't enough to rattle Trump's empire, the very next day she turned her sights on Speaker Johnson. If Donald Trump embodied the bombast of arrogance, Speaker Mike Johnson represented its polished, sanctimonious face. Where Trump shouted, Johnson smiled. Where Trump flailed, Johnson folded his hands as if in prayer. He was the gatekeeper of a Congress paralyzed by partisanship, cloaking himself in scripture and piety, while bending every rule to serve his faction. To many in Washington, he was untouchable, a man who could sanctify corruption simply by dressing it in the language of morality. When Johnson rose to speak, he exuded confidence, his words carefully chosen, his tone calm and measured. He invoked faith, family, and the Constitution as though he alone was ordained to defend them. He carried himself like a shepherd guiding his flock through chaos, and for a long time, no one dared to point out that the flock he led was stumbling toward hypocrisy and decay. Enter Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes fixed on him with the calm intensity of someone who had seen this performance before. She let him finish his polished monologue, the familiar blend of scripture and politics, the polished assurances that corruption wasn't corruption if it wore the right clothes. The chamber hummed with the same expectation. Crockett would fire back, but surely Johnson's calm facade would hold. He was, after all, the speaker, shielded by his position, guarded by the confidence of power. But Crockett didn't take the bait. She didn't raise her voice, didn't meet his pious tone with anger. Instead, she began with quiet questions. How could a man speak of morality while defending policies that stripped families of their dignity? How could he invoke faith while turning a blind eye to cruelty? She placed his words side by side with his record, each contradiction laid bare like cracks in glass. Johnson shifted in his chair. He smiled, then frowned, then smiled again as though the mask he wore was slipping. He tried to interject, to reframe her accusations as misunderstandings, but Crockett pressed on with the persistence of truth. Every time he claimed purity, she revealed compromise. Every time he invoked faith, she pointed to the corruption he excused in the name of power. The tension in the room thickened. Members leaned forward, staffers whispered. It was the kind of moment rarely seen in the halls of Congress, a performance stripped of theater, replaced by revelation. Crockett wasn't grandstanding. She was methodically peeling back the layers of a man who had built his identity on the illusion of righteousness. And then she struck the emotional chord that cut through his defenses. She reminded him and the country that leadership is not about cloaking cowardice in scripture. Leadership is about sacrifice, accountability, and courage. A title doesn't make you moral, she said, her voice steady. Actions do. For the first time, Johnson's mask cracked. He fumbled for words, his tone less certain, his cadence less controlled. The camera caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. The audience felt it too the moment when the shepherd was revealed to be just another politician, hiding behind the words he had twisted to shield himself from judgment. Outside the chamber, the reaction was immediate. Clips of the exchange lit up social media. Hashtags like Johnson Exposed and Faith vs. Facts trended. Commentators replayed the footage on cable news, marveling at how Crockett, with precision and patience, had done what few dared: call out the hypocrisy of a speaker who wielded religion like armor, while his hands were stained with politics as usual. And for millions watching, it was more than political theater. It was validation. How many Americans had felt dismissed, scolded, or shamed by leaders who weaponized faith against them? How many had wondered if anyone in Congress had the courage to say aloud what everyone already knew, that the sanctimony was a lie? Crockett gave voice to that collective frustration, turning unease into empowerment. In that moment, the underdog became the defender of truth, and Johnson, the man who thought himself untouchable, looked suddenly small. The clash wasn't just about policy or politics. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of an institution that had long placed appearances over accountability. But Crockett wasn't finished. With America watching, she aimed higher: the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court chamber has always carried an air of untouchable reverence. The marble columns, the hushed tones, the black robes, everything about it was designed to project permanence, inevitability, authority. And seated among those 9 justices was Coney Barrett, cloaked not only in her robe, but in the weight of a lifetime appointment. To her allies, she was a symbol of triumph. To her critics, the proof that democracy itself had been hijacked. Either way, she appeared untouchable, elevated above the reach of ordinary challenge. But Jasmine Crockett was not ordinary. The moment she entered that room, there was a shift not in the grandeur of the setting, but in the energy pulsing beneath it. She stood as a representative of the people in a place that often felt sealed off from them. Her presence was defiance, a reminder that even the highest court was not beyond question. Barrett began as expected, speaking in the measured cadence of judicial authority. Her words carried the cool detachment of someone who believed her position was shield enough from critique. She spoke of precedent, of process, of neutrality, cloaking herself in the solemnity of the institution. And for a few moments it seemed the script would play out as it always did. A justice would speak, and the world would nod. But Crockett did not nod. Her voice, clear and unwavering, sliced through the silence like a blade. She spoke not as a politician grasping for sound bites, but as a citizen demanding accountability. She asked the question that lingered unspoken in millions of minds. How could a court claim neutrality while consistently siding with power over people? How could a justice claim impartiality when her very seat was the product of political maneuvering and hypocrisy? The chamber grew still. Reporters froze their pens mid-sentence. Staffers looked up from their notes. Even the justices shifted, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Crockett was not deferential. She was direct. She stripped away the protective veil of tradition and exposed the truth behind it, that the robe was not a shield from scrutiny. That legitimacy had to be earned, not assumed. Barrett tried to respond with calm authority, repeating the familiar lines about impartial judgment. But Crockett pressed, her words anchored in moral clarity. "Impartiality is not a claim," she said. "It's a practice, and the people know the difference." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every ear strained to hear Barrett's reply, but none came quickly. That pause, that hesitation, spoke louder than any defense she could muster. In that instant, the image of untouchable authority cracked. The audience felt it, the tension of centuries-old reverence colliding with the raw demand for justice. Some sat frozen, others leaned forward, their breath caught in their throats. The silence wasn't empty. It was electric, alive with the realization that even the highest seat of power could be held to account. Outside those marble walls, the impact was explosive. Clips of Crockett's confrontation spread with lightning speed. Hashtags like "Justice Questioned" and "Crockett vs. Court" dominated feeds. Commentators marveled at the audacity, not recklessness, but courage of a woman who dared to ask the questions so many were too intimidated to voice. For progressives, it was vindication. For the establishment, it was a warning. In a single exchange, Crockett had pierced the illusion of inevitability. She reminded the nation that robes and titles do not sanctify injustice, that authority without accountability is nothing but a mask. Her words became a rallying cry, a declaration that democracy belongs not to the powerful few, but to the people willing to challenge them. 3 clashes in 7 days. But the true drama was only beginning. There are moments in politics when the noise fades, when the spectacle collapses under its own weight, and a single voice cuts through with such clarity that the world cannot look away. For Jasmine Crockett, that moment came not in a whisper, not in a shout, but in the steady crescendo of truth delivered against 3 towering figures who thought themselves unassailable. The week had already shocked Washington. Trump rattled, Johnson exposed, Barrett silenced. Each clash had been its own battle, but on the 7th day, Crockett brought it all together. She didn't just recount what had happened. She framed the entire saga as a trial of America's soul. The chamber was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Cameras flashed, pens hovered over notepads, and screens across the nation waited. Even her opponents leaned in, convinced they could weather whatever she was about to say. She began with silence, a pause long enough to make even the confident shuffle in their seats. When she spoke, her voice carried not anger, but certainty. Over the course of 1 week, she said, I've stood before a former president, a Speaker of the House, and a Supreme Court justice. And what did I see? I saw arrogance dressed as leadership. I saw corruption cloaked in scripture. I saw hypocrisy hidden behind robes. Gasps fluttered through the audience. Trump scowled. Johnson shifted. Barrett lowered her gaze. Crockett let the moment breathe, the silence amplifying the weight of her words. But here's the truth, she continued, her voice sharper now. Power doesn't make you right. Volume doesn't make you strong. And titles don't make you moral. The people are watching. They see the contradictions. They see the fear behind the bluster. They see the cowardice hiding behind claims of faith. And they see the emptiness in robes that refuse accountability. The words struck like hammer blows. Trump, who had once dominated every room, looked cornered, his face red with restrained fury. Johnson's lips pressed tight, his usual calm cracked by visible discomfort. Barrett's hands clasped tighter, her silence no longer dignified but defensive. Crockett pressed forward, building the rhythm of her counterattack. Each pause, each inflection was calculated. She invoked the struggles of working families left behind while billionaires cried victimhood. She reminded the nation that leadership is measured not in titles, but in service. She tied every villain's hypocrisy into a single thread, a narrative of arrogance unraveling under the weight of truth. America is not a throne, she declared. It is not a pulpit. And it is not a bench for the privileged few. America is a promise that dignity belongs to every person, not just those who claim it for themselves. The room held its breath. The cameras drank in every second. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny the electricity coursing through the chamber. Then came the line that would echo across the nation. She turned, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering. You have all mistaken fear for respect, but fear fades. Respect is earned. And today, the people can see who deserves it and who does not. The chamber erupted. Applause thundered. Gasps punctuated the noise, and the villains once so confident sat diminished, shadows of their former selves. Trump's glare looked less like dominance and more like desperation. Johnson scribbled furiously, searching for a response that would not come. Barrett's silence was deafening. Her authority cracked under the weight of questions left unanswered. Outside the chamber, the ripple effect was instantaneous. Clips of the speech surged across social media like a tidal wave. Hashtags exploded. Ya Crockett counterattack. Truth mic drop. Fear vs respect. Within hours, her words were trending worldwide. Late-night shows replayed her mic drop line again and again, audiences cheering as if they had witnessed a sporting victory. Commentators on every network dissected the moment. Some called her the new face of resistance. Others said she had accomplished what generations of opponents had failed to do: expose the hollowness behind Trump's rage, Johnson's sanctimony, and Barrett's silence. Even those who disagreed with her politics admitted the performance was unforgettable, a masterclass in composure, clarity, and courage. For ordinary people, it was more than news. It was validation. Immigrants saw in her the reflection of their struggles. Young activists saw proof that dignity could triumph over arrogance. Families at dinner tables replayed the clips, parents telling their children, "That's what courage looks like." In barbershops, in classrooms, in living rooms, her words became fuel for conversation, for pride, for hope. And yet, it wasn't just her supporters who reacted. The villains themselves felt the tremors. Trump raged in interviews, calling her nobody, only to have the clips of his meltdown go viral once more. Johnson scrambled to frame his faith as strength, but the internet was already flooded with Crockett's dismantling of his contradictions. Barrett issued no public comment, her silence only reinforcing the narrative that the questions she faced could not be answered without unraveling her credibility. What Crockett had achieved was bigger than a political takedown. She had shifted the balance of perception. She had shown that power could be questioned, that arrogance could be exposed, that dignity could stand tall without apology. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of a new kind of leadership, one grounded not in fear, but in respect earned through truth. The effect lingered. For days, clips replayed. For weeks, her words echoed. And for months, the memory of that mic-drop counterattack would shape the way people saw not just her, but the villains she had confronted. She hadn't just survived the gauntlet of giants. She had left them diminished, their myths fractured, their arrogance exposed. It was a moment that reminded America of its own heartbeat, a reminder that even in the halls of power, truth could still ring louder than lies. But what happened after shook Washington to its core. The dust had barely settled from Jasmine Crockett's mic drop counterattack when the ripple effects began, tearing across the country. What happened in that chamber wasn't confined to marble walls or congressional transcripts. It spilled instantly into the bloodstream of America's culture. Social media lit up like fireworks. Clips of her words, her composure, and her steady gaze were shared, reshared, and remixed into every format imaginable. One video of her line, "You have all mistaken fear for respect," racked up 1 million views in under an hour. Another, slowed down with dramatic music, was stitched alongside Trump's scowl, Johnson's nervous shifting, and Barrett's frozen silence. The captions were merciless. Dignity 3, arrogance 0. Memes flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Trump's furious face became the new "when you realize you've been exposed" meme. Johnson's scribbling hands were labeled "when you forgot to do the homework," and Barrett's pause was captioned "buffering." The hashtags trended worldwide. Crockett mic drop, respect over fear, Jasmine for the people. Ordinary Americans, teachers, nurses, veterans, immigrants chimed in with their own stories. "I've waited my whole life to see someone say what we all feel," wrote one teacher from Michigan. "She spoke for every immigrant who's been told to stay quiet," posted a dreamer from California. Within days, Crockett's name was no longer just a headline, it was a movement. Late-night comedy shows seized on the moment. One host replayed the clip of Trump's meltdown, pausing it mid-shout to let the audience laugh at his reddened face. Another host quipped, "Mike Johnson wanted to quote the Bible, but apparently forgot the part about not bearing false witness." The biggest laugh of the week came when a comedian compared Barrett's silence to "when your Wi-Fi freezes right as you're asked a question in Zoom court." Audiences roared, but behind the laughter was a shared sense that the untouchables had finally been touched. Celebrities added fuel. An Oscar-winning actor tweeted, "That was the performance of the year and it wasn't even on screen." A pop star posted Crockett's line as an Instagram caption, followed by a flood of heart emojis and the words, "This is what courage looks like." Even athletes weighed in, with one NBA player declaring after a playoff win, "We're bringing Crockett energy tonight, calm, strong, unstoppable." For voters, the impact was deeper than entertainment. Town halls and community meetings buzzed with her name. In neighborhoods where politics had once felt distant and alien, Crockett's composure made people feel seen. Immigrants replayed her words for their children, telling them, "This is why we never give up." Older Americans said she reminded them of leaders from another era, when integrity felt possible. Young people, disillusioned with politics as usual, saw in her a reason to believe again. The villains, meanwhile, found themselves trapped in the echo chamber of mockery. Trump's furious denials only reinforced the narrative. Every angry post, every insult he hurled, was stitched into viral videos that painted him as flailing and weak. Johnson's attempt to spin his clash as a misunderstanding was drowned out by the endless replay of him fumbling for words. Barrett remained silent, but silence itself had become incriminating. The internet had already judged, and judgment was merciless. The story reached beyond politics. Newspapers ran op-eds titled, "The Week One Woman Redefined Resistance." Cable news pundits debated not whether she had won, but how far the shockwaves would travel. Polls began to reflect the moment. Favorability numbers spiked. Name recognition skyrocketed, and support surged in communities far outside her district. And through it all, the emotional beat resonated like a drum. The people had chosen their hero, not a celebrity manufactured by Hollywood, not a billionaire propped up by wealth, not a dynastic heir to power, but a congresswoman dismissed as just another voice who proved that dignity could still triumph over arrogance. For 1 week, Jasmine Crockett had turned the political world upside down. But even as America replayed her words and laughed at the villain's humiliation, a larger truth was settling in. This wasn't just about a viral moment or even 3 confrontations that shook the powerful. It wasn't just about 1 week. It was about America's future. When the noise of the week finally quieted, Jasmine Crockett stood not as a victor basking in applause, but as a messenger with something larger to say. Reporters chased her, pundits speculated about her future, hashtags immortalized her words. Yet when she spoke to the cameras, her message was clear. This was never just about me. She reminded the country that her clashes with Trump, Johnson, and Barrett were not personal vendettas. They were reflections of a deeper battle, the struggle between arrogance and dignity, corruption and truth, fear and respect. She framed her 7 days not as a string of viral moments, but as a parable of democracy itself. Fragile, embattled, yet still alive whenever ordinary people stood up to power. Titles don't make a person untouchable, she said. The people give power, and the people can take it back. What you saw wasn't about me versus them. It was about us versus the idea that we don't matter. Her words carried beyond politics. They resonated in churches where congregants remembered Johnson's hypocrisy. They echoed in classrooms where young people, weary of cynicism, suddenly felt hope stir. They traveled across kitchen tables where families, immigrants, workers, veterans saw their struggles reflected in her steady defiance. Crockett didn't claim victory for herself. Instead, she elevated it into a lesson. That dignity, when held firmly, can outlast the loudest insult, the coldest silence, and the most sanctimonious speech. When arrogance faces dignity, she declared, dignity always wins. It was more than a line, it was a creed, a reminder that power without respect crumbles, that fear is temporary, but truth endures. Her reflection turned the week into a mirror, asking every viewer to see themselves in the struggle. If she, underestimated and dismissed, could hold her ground before giants, then anyone could stand for justice in their own corner of America. The emotional tide shifted from outrage to empowerment. People didn't just cheer for her. They felt validated, as though her strength had unlocked their own. She had not only confronted villains in power, she had reframed what power meant. It wasn't in the hands of the loudest or the most privileged, it belonged to those who refused to bow. Commentators tried to box her in. Was she the future of the party? A symbol of resistance? But Crockett resisted labels, reminding the nation that what mattered wasn't her trajectory, but the collective momentum. This isn't about one woman with a microphone, she said. It's about millions of voices deciding not to be silent. Her humility elevated the triumph into something bigger, something enduring. It wasn't just Crockett's week, it was America's reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport, that every person, whether in Congress or in a community meeting, has the right and the responsibility to demand better. And so the week ended not as a closed chapter, but as an opening. Crockett's calm fire had shown what was possible when truth faced arrogance head-on. Her voice had broken through the noise not because it was the loudest, but because it carried the weight of countless unheard voices. The moral was clear, soaring, unshakable. Dignity will always outlast arrogance, because dignity is rooted in something deeper than ego. It is rooted in the people themselves, empowered and validated. Americans were left not with the memory of one congresswoman's defiance, but with a reflection of their own potential. And that, more than any viral clip or trending hashtag, was the legacy of those 7 days. In just 7 days, Jasmine Crockett exposed the cracks in three of America's most powerful figures. She revealed Trump's bluster for what it was, noise without substance. She showed Johnson's scripture-laced sanctimony to be nothing more than cowardice, dressed in faith. She stripped Barrett's robe of its illusion of inevitability, proving that even the highest bench is not immune to accountability. The story of that week is not just political drama. It is a reminder of the eternal truth. Justice will always outlast corruption, and truth will always outshine arrogance. Crockett's courage wasn't about defeating three names. It was about defending the very idea of democracy, that dignity belongs to the people, not to those who wield power carelessly. And now, the choice belongs to you. If you felt validated by her defiance, if you saw yourself in her calm strength, if you believe that dignity must always rise above hate, then this is your movement too. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel so that the fire of truth keeps burning. Add your voice, because silence is what arrogance depends on. Crockett's week was proof of what can happen when one person refuses to bow. But the next chapter depends on millions refusing to stay quiet. This isn't just her fight, it's ours. Because when one voice rises, a nation follows.